I want to go over real quick the work that you guys did with the milestones. You did an excellent job. Your ages were really great. I want to, however, highlight those of you who, in many of the areas, decided to, they were saying the older age would say it doesn't matter, or absolutely could do it, especially when it came to marriage or other aspects. This is where we have to start putting a kind of like, be concerned about ageism, right? We need to start to think about this notion of what does it mean to have an ideal time for doing something. Is there such a thing? Should we really be making that determination? What does it say about us and the way that we think about the world around us if we have this kind of ideal time? This exercise serves two purposes. One is to get you thinking about the notion of the life course, which I'm going to talk about briefly in a little bit. And of course, in that notion, really start to capture some of the biases that we carry with us regarding when things should be done. At what age should someone be doing X, Y, and Z? And of course, what does it mean when we say that someone hasn't achieved this? Are we saying that they are a failure, or are we saying that there's something wrong with them, right? So please keep that in mind. A lot of this comes, and you'll read this in your textbook, right? Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, and he's the first one to prior to this, Freud and other psychologists at the time were talking about development, and development was something that was done very early on. So for someone like Freud, the social development, psychosocial development happened at a very early stage, and then your ability to transition from one to the other of these stages determined your psychological health, right? Your overall well-being, right? This is what development does. So Erikson does the exact same thing. He's not doing anything too different. He does the exact same thing all the way down to the Oedipus complex that falls into this. He kind of falls into that same thing. However, the reality is that he does something that's far more interesting in that he extends this. He extends this to begin the process of including people who are older. And this is where it gets very interesting. And this is where you have to think about, you know, what does it mean to transition from one to the other? Here's a better way of kind of looking at Erikson's stages. I know it's a little bit, you can't see the bottom down here too well, but if you think about it, right, his stages: first year of life, you build trust or mistrust, right? Faith in the environment and future events, suspension of fear in future events, right? Basically, favorable outcomes versus unfavorable outcomes and the crisis that occurs. And trust and mistrust is, think about it as a child, right? The trust you have in your parent of taking care of you, not taking care of you, those can create an issue. If you, favorable outcome of that is that you have faith in that environment. The unfavorable is that you're suspicious. At the second year, you have autonomy versus doubt, right? A sense of self-control and adequacy, feelings of shame and doubt. This is tied very much to Freud's idea of the anal stage. And so, yes, I did say anal stage, and that's because at this particular moment in time, these people are obsessed with potty training and believe that potty training will create either good sense of autonomy and self-control or bad feelings and shame. Right? This is the notion of how the significance of potty training is for a child's development. From 3 to 5th year is the initiative and guilt. It's the ability to be self-starter, to initiate one's own activity, or a sense of guilt, inadequacy. And for Erikson and for Freud, this is the Oedipus stage, and this is where the person has a strong attachment to their mother and builds a resentful relationship with their father, and easily transitioning to this is what allows them to become, gain some initiative, or the guilt of, not, wanting the mother over the father, and all these things can create, it's complicated, and honestly, it's extremely problematic. Let's just leave it at that, because we're not going deep into psychological criticism of developmental stage of the early 20th century. We're not really doing that. We're just kind of going through these stages quickly, right? By the way, these stages are not set in stone. These are kind of the best guess estimate. For them, it was set in stone. Today, we don't think of development as these things that are set in stone, right? And that's not even to mention what it means for people who have neurodivergency and how these changes, these stages can be different for them, right? 6 to puberty is industry versus inferiority, right? Ability to understand how things work or not understand how things work. Then there's the transition, which is adolescence, where you build identity versus confusion, right? This is, if you will, this is the high school years, the middle school, high school years, where you're learning to be, who you are, and think of like, I know it's stereotypical, but think of like the notions of like the high school jocks versus high school nerds versus the cheerleader versus, the book girl kind of things, just think about those types of things, right? Those types of identities. And this is what it kind of trying to capture. It's in actuality much more complicated than that, but just we're going through this kind of briefly and quick. Right? Adulthood is the early part, intimacy, isolation. This is where you begin to connect with others and hopefully find a romantic partner. Middle age, generativity or self-absorption, and this is where you begin to become either more selfless and start giving. So when we talk about generativity, is about being generous. So, taking care of your children, making sure that your children can move forward, putting them ahead, or, stuck with your own self and that, oh no, I only work for me, I only, you're workaholic, your sense of identity and where you belong in that job, you're so self-absorbed. That's kind of what the argument there is. Yes, this is problematic in and of itself as well, but it does lead to the way people think about where people should be at different stages in life. And of course, at the end, it's the integrity versus despair, and this to me is the most funniest part. However, it plays into ways in which people think about, especially people who are older, right? The idea is, are you ready to die, or are you fearful of dying, right? A sense of integrity, fulfillment, and willingness to face death versus dissatisfaction with life and despair over the prospects of death, right? Am I ready to die? And I'm not ready to go yet, kind of interaction here. But I think it's important because these stages kind of highlights, right, this notion of what people transition to. And this is a basic, and your textbook on cognitive section actually will go through some of the critiques of this and we'll play some of it. Now, mind you, this is just a survey course. We're not intended to go deep into it, and it's a survey course that's not covering psychology. It's covering, right, gerontology and one section of, cognitive behavior and thinking about cognition. So please keep that in mind, all right? You're not becoming experts in this. We're covering deeply, but feel free to investigate it further and think about other classes as you go along, right? Psychology of the lifespan. There are great courses out there that go into much more details about this that are very, very interesting. This is a good way of thinking about a person's life course. And this table here kind of highlights what happens during a person's life course, right? On the left-hand side, this side right here, right, is a person's function, right? If we think about this, right, this slide here represents a person's ability to function, right? And this side here represents the aging process. And what happens is that when you're born, you have certain functions, abilities that you have, right? This is everything from being able to eat, right, breathe, those types of things. Yes, they're minimal with a certain aspect, right? You can only drink certain liquids. You can't, so that's kind of way in which, if you're breastfeeding, the notion of a child being able to suckle, right, to suck on things, that becomes like one of those reflex type of things that you expect a child to be able to do, right? The swallowing is part of that. So child is born and is able to do those types of things, right? The breathing is natural, right? It's just part. Sleeping and waking and stuff like that, that becomes kind of the natural things. These are all functions that you're able to perform. Eventually, right, as you get older, these functions begin to grow. As these functions begin to grow, your ability to be able to do things expand. This is coincided, right, with age. It's connected to age. So the older you get, the more you can do. What has an effect on this, obviously, is health, right? If you are a healthy person, right, you can experience so these are environmental changes to health. You can experience a much more functioning, longer lifespan, as opposed to if you have environmental challenges. This might be the case, right? And you can have acute health issues that can decrease your ability to live And so these are how these life courses are looked at, right? The arrow up here indicates greater resiliency. This indicates declining health, right? So you can see here declining health, declining function. Notice that this goes up, eventually it plateaus, right? And then you have this kind of slow decline. And this is what your book is kind of trying to highlight, is this aspect here. What happens after you reach this point and you begin to see some of this decline, right? What does that mean physiologically? Here's another way of looking at it, right? Where a person, and it's just one line, so if you can imagine, right, a person is born and, they reach their teen age, right, and then they're going up here, then you reach a point where your function kind of flats. We can think of this at the age of 25, 26, 24, so this is where we begin to see, and then you have, now this is not a complete flat, you can have continual increase, it's just that the increase is not as fast as what happens between the ages of birth to about that age of 20, 25, right around there, and then you start to see right around here, which represents at around that 50th age, right, that kind of slow decline until eventually you have death. And this is all considered to be the life course, right? A person's life is exists in this kind of life course matrix, right? You want to think about it, a good way of thinking about it is think about athletes, right? An athlete is born, they do great, right? They become, develop a lot of skills, right? They play the sport, they do extremely, extremely well, and then eventually as they age, right, you see them aging out right around that age of about 40. If you think about, for example, football players, baseball players, right, they start hitting that limit right around the age of 40. Yes, there's some that go past that. This is how things work, but you see a kind of like a slow deterioration happening after that point, to the point where they have to leave their sports and retire. This is how you have people retiring at what sometimes are very young ages from a lot of these sports, right? That's if they last that long. Remember, it is very rare to see some of these, athletes in these very high, physically demanding sports to be able to continue their sports at that professional level past this point. So this is how we think about it, right? In this life course, right, comes the age that you guys have been putting together. Now, here is a study that's done by the Stanford's lifetime kind of like life course project, and I'll put the studies, there's a link to the studies at the end here for you guys to look at and pay attention to. And again, these are just resources for you to have, right? And I want you to think about this as you're thinking about what numbers that you put in there, because they're not too far from the numbers that are here. And so they did something very similar, and they said, okay, here is like the ideal age for full-time jobs, except that they looked at different people in different age groups, right? The yellow represents people who are 75 and older, and notice that everybody, when it comes to full-time job, around the age of 22. So as soon as you graduate from college, you're expected to start a full-time job. Although many of you, not just you alone, in the other classes as well, I did this in several classes, put down 25 as the starting point for your age. I wonder if that is related to the economy in the way that we're thinking about the economy. But so the big full-time job right here is around the age of 22, and that's almost for all ages, right? For the younger group that represents blue, you can see right here when you say start saving for retirement, they believe that you should start saving for retirement exactly at that point in time. However, for older individuals, you can see it's much later. Part of the reason is that older individuals are realizing that you really don't save that much during this time period. So I think there's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy here. It's like, no, you can wait. It's okay to wait. So that's that part right there. However, feel free to start saving early. That's not what I'm saying. And then you look at marriage, right? And you see here where you start seeing the difference, right? Those who are much older in the green and the yellow believe you should be married a little bit younger. Those who are the youngest, however, are right here in the middle, right around 26, together with those at 55. And yet those between 35 and 54, which represents millennials, believe that you should be waiting a little bit longer. And the interesting thing is that many of these are, past that age of marriage, the ideal age of marriage of about 27. So it's an interesting contrast to kind of see that they said, no, you should be waiting longer. But a lot of this is the millennial, and maybe the economy also had a role in this. When you say buying a home, notice here the same thing. people who are, this tends to be a little bit broader, but a lot of this, I'm assuming, is tied to the economy and where they were in the housing market, right? Much older people think you should wait a little bit longer. Younger people are not too far from them. The real distinction is between that 55 and 64 years of age, who believe that you should do it younger, and those people who are 35 and 44 years of age. And this marks a real generation shift and probably where they were based on the housing crisis. Those who were 55 and 64, which represents kind of that Gen X group, are probably had their homes already, so saying buy your homes makes sense, while millennials, who were right in the middle of that housing crisis and were aware of it, probably are now kind of skittish about the idea of when you should buy a home, right? And of course, starting a family, much older people believe you should start a family sooner, and as you see, right, millennials are way up here, while those who are 25 to 34 are a little bit closer to the group between that 45 to 74 age range, right? But you could see the clear differences across these two groups. Here's another way in which you can look at that same data, just showing you the differences by age. And of course, this is a nice diagram that shows you the discrepancies between ideal age and actual age at which people experience those events, right? So if you think about this, right, when did they marry? So 25 to 34-year-olds say you should be married at 26, but most of them are finding out that they're not marrying until about 27, right? 35-year-olds are much closer together, 45 to 54 are right there, but you can see right here that 75-year-olds say you should wait until you're at least 25, but most of them got married by the age of 22. See that see this line here versus the actual right here, which puts people more closer together than how they appear in the middle. Same thing with buying a home, right? You can see the actual, right, goes this way, right? Older people bought homes much earlier, younger people are waiting much, much longer, and you can see that, the ideal age was kind of like closer together, but in reality it is not. And same thing with when they start a family. If you look at when people actually are starting families, right? If you're younger, you're waiting much, much longer. And all of these, right? If you're younger, your actual time period for all of these are much later in life. It's only, if you're older, they were much earlier in life. This is important because it allows us to start thinking about, if we're talking about the life course, where people belong in the life course, and when you should accomplish things, it kind of shows you how these things aren't built, right, solely on human beings acting and behaving in ways that they are programmed to react, but that society has a significant impact on where they fall within these life stages. And that's one of the things we're going to be finding. I do have these links that provide you with a better understanding. One of them shows you Europe, and some European perspectives. Some of these are global, so the Pew Research Center right here, this link will show you some of these global differences. I didn't want to go and give you too much on any of these things, but I do want to end by bringing us back to this idea of the life course and what that means and where do you fall and when you should accomplish things and how you should have things done by, and how is it that we expect people to hold on to these things, and how much of it is real versus social conditioning versus social expectations, and how much of it is driven by our own biases. And so we need to start thinking about what these things are and what these things mean. This doesn't mean that there aren't physiological and cognitive conditions that affect where a person should be doing, right? Someone who is 50 years old is going to have an extremely difficult time trying to get into a physical sport than someone who is, in their teens, right? This is a real thing. There's a real capacity difference here. In their teens, you are gaining function. In your 50s, you are losing function, right? Those are real physiological traits that have an effect on a person's opportunity and what they can do. But the question becomes not what is it they can do, the question is, are we going to view what they can do based off of this notion? Are there ways around this? Are there certain things that don't fit? I like to think of it in this way, right? So women can give birth, bear with me on this for a second, right, until around the period where they reach menopause, in which case then they are no longer being able to produce their own eggs and be able to, you know, have a child. But we've known that through in vitro fertilization and other means, the implanting of embryos into a healthy uterus, regardless of the woman's age, can allow for the woman to carry a pregnancy. So, you know, how much of that is technology driven versus not? And so we need to keep in mind these ideas and these notions of why things are the way they are and how they manifest. And so this Milestone project, in a lot of ways, is to kind of point that out to you in a very direct way. And I hope that you enjoyed it. I really enjoyed reading a lot of the responses there. You guys are brilliant, and but there were not that many distinctions in what these age groups were. I'm just going to point that out. So keep that as a way of thinking about it.